My name is Sofia Ehrich, and I'm an art historian, researcher, and consultant for multisensory experiences. My company, the Olfactory Contractor, coaches and consults museum practitioners and others on the educational impact smell can have on the public. It is my pleasure to welcome you as the host of the Internet of Senses Institute podcast for the Sense of Smell. And today I have Dr. Leslie M.K. with me, who holds a Bachelor in Liberal Arts from St. John's College and a PhD in Biophysics from UC Berkeley. She completed her postdoctoral research at the California Institute of Technology before joining the University of Chicago faculty. Her research investigates how brains process the sense of smell, with a particular interest in how context and experience affect sensory perception and how different parts of the brain communicate with each other during sensory processing. She has published widely in scientific journals and is a leading expert on the connection between the sense of smell and brain health. Sounds really interesting, Leslie, so I'm excited to talk to you today.
Well, thank you so much, Sophia, for having me on. I'm a big fan.
Oh, thank
And
you.
yes, I am. And to introduce myself on top of that nice introduction, really my background is in mathematics and philosophy, and I sort of stumbled into neuroscience, which I think made it a good path for me to study the sense of smell, because I think it's a really philosophical sense. And although I wanted to be a mathematician, I started studying the rat olfactory system, and I kind of haven't looked back. And
The rat olfactory system.
Mostly the rat olfactory system, but more recently human. I focus on system dynamics. So rather than thinking about brains as modular computers like Legos, I think of them more as, integrated whole system complex dynamical machines. And so where behavior and meaning and thinking and neural activity are all integrated with each other. And I think that's really key to understanding smell, in fact.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, I
Yeah.
think. So you said you started in mathematics.
Yeah.
How did you end up focusing your research on the sense of smell or
Yeah.
olfaction?
Yeah. It's, like all the best things in life, it's a long, complicated story, but it was really an accident. I met my eventual PhD advisor, Walter Freeman, who was sort of a maverick in neuroscience. He was really one of the first people talking about brains as complex systems, and when in the US, the focus was really on thinking about brains as feature detectors. And I was just fascinated by how he thought. I had a conversation with him, and I liked the books on his shelf. He had shelves full of philosophy and poetry, and out in the hallway in the bookcase were all the neuroscience books. But in his office, he was in a different world. And I really appreciated that, I could talk across both realms with him. So, I came in, I said, I want to do math, model brains. And he was like, wow, we'll see. I imagined the cigar in his mouth, right? And he just gave me some data to work on, and the rest is history. I had a question, I had to do an experiment, and then I became a physiologist. But I really learned from him how to think about brains, and he happened to be working on olfaction. So for many years, I was really focused on brain dynamics. And in about the past 15 years, I'd say, although I've been studying olfaction the whole time, I became super focused on smell, rather than just here's an example of a cool system that does cool brain dynamics. It became, this is about smell and smell. And I started studying what smells smell like instead of just grabbing some off the shelf, and learning about scents and learning about the history of olfaction and the history of perfume and all kinds of stuff. So, yeah. So
Well, and talk about a complex
I've been in,
system.
yeah, I've been in smell for 30 years, right? But I've been in smell for about 15 years, I guess.
I mean, I'm not an expert on brains, but I
Mm-hmm.
think the sense of smell is such a complex system. And something that's so interesting about it is how it's processed in the brain and how you make such interesting connections through your sense
Yeah.
of smell. So
Yeah.
definitely, I think works for for when thinking about brains as complex systems in your case.
Yeah, it really is the case that, I mean, we know this in neuroscience and psychology that we construct our internal worlds, but in the case of the sense of smell, we can actually show that in the brain. We can we can show how neurons change their representation of the outside world as the meaning of the stimulus changes for the animal. And now I'm working with a couple of colleagues, but for this purpose with Christina Zolano at Northwestern, where we're recording human olfactory bulbs in people, smelling odors, and they do the same things that rats' olfactory bulbs do.
Oh,
It's actually kind
interesting.
of astounding.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm sure we will talk more about that. So I wanted to get a like kind of a groundwork for in case those people who are watching may not understand how smells processed in the brain or why it's important that we talk about how smells processed in the brain. In I know you like the brains, so in brains.
Yeah.
So I'll
In
try to
brains.
say that.
Yes, that's okay.
So do you want to talk about that a bit?
Sure. The sense of smell has the most direct access of all our sensory systems to the sort of core of what makes us human or what makes us us or what makes a rat a rat. Our personal life experience depends on these core structures in the brain called the limbic system. Some people call it a lizard brain, which it isn't. It sort of does a disservice even to lizards because they're much more complicated than people think they are. But it's this part of the brain that's essential for making new memories, for putting memories together in sequence, for understanding where we are in space, for emotional responses, for looking at something and mobilizing our body's responses in the case of emotions. When your heart races, when you're excited about something, all of those are sort of governed by this limbic system. And the olfactory system, the neurons in your nose go directly to your olfactory bulb. And from there, they are in the middle of the limbic system. So one synapse from really the periphery into the center workings of kind of the core structures of our brains. So that's why smells have these, really important feelings and connections to memory and all that. And I know you've interviewed Rachel Hurst, and I don't remember if it came up, but smell memories are not, they're not better. What you remember with them are not better, but they feel like they are, right? They feel like they're true. It's this feeling of experience. And that's
Yeah.
why I think smell not only has this really cool anatomy and access to the center of who we are, but also gives us an opportunity to really explore how that happens in the brain.
And why do you think it's important for us to be aware of these aspects of how smell is processed in the brain?
Well, I mean, that's a whole brain health can of worms, right? Because, the connection between your nose, which inhales all kinds of pathogens, as we discovered during COVID, right? And that's how we get colds. That's how we, get lots of things. And our olfactory bulb, which is just a couple millimeters away, right? That nerve is very short. It goes right from your nose into your brain. And it has to go through some holes, right? So here's your the bottom of your skull. It's very thin right there. There's some holes and the nerve goes right through it into the olfactory bulb, which is part of your main cerebral cortex. And so there's holes in your skull where stuff goes through, right? So, you would think, oh no, there's garbage floating around in my nose. Why doesn't it just all leak into my brain? Well, we have lots of protections for that, and especially have lots of protections around that in the nose and in the olfactory bulb. Very robust, immune response, but, stuff can get in. And so we have to be very careful, to not shove things up our nose. We have to take care of our sense of smell, to protect it. And in fact, using our sense of smell actually does kind of exercise those key areas of our brain that are important for brain health.
So is that also if, for example, I know certain conditions related to brain health also affect our sense of smell. So are you saying that those things enter us also through those holes in our brain, or
Yeah.
or
Well,
is
yeah,
that
I
more to
mean,
do with like pathogens or illness?
there was this theory. It was floating around for about 20 years, and then people started paying more attention to it. When you lose your sense of smell about 10 years or more before some diseases that end in dementia, right?
Yeah.
And also Parkinson's disease. I don't think the smell deficit is always correlated with dementia there. And in some of those diseases, the first degeneration in the brain starts in the olfactory bulb. So this question has been, what, do you just get a cold one day and 10 years later you get dementia? What's going on? And it turns out it's not that. A lot of people lose their sense of smell peripherally. And as far as we can tell, they just can't smell, right? I mean, the way they process things in their brains is a little different, but they don't get Alzheimer's disease. They don't get Parkinson's disease from losing their sense of smell. But in some cases, pathogens do get in the brain, or there's an immune response that's too big and kills cells. And so there's been this theory, maybe you get a cold and then you get dementia, and it was kind of a joke. And then people started paying more attention to this and seeing that, in fact, you can do certain kinds of damage to the olfactory bulb in mice and mimic, say, the progression of Parkinson's disease, for example, or at least the progression of the damage to the brain that occurs in Parkinson's disease. But it's a really hard thing to test unless you have a whole bunch of people who get sick at the same time.
I guess in 4 years we have some good research that'll come out from
Yeah,
COVID, right?
unfortunately. Yeah, unfortunate.
Unfortunately.
It's, natural experiment, it's called. And
Yeah.
so, and this happened actually with the Spanish flu epidemic. There was a bump in, I think it was schizophrenia about 20 years later, and it was tracked to women who were pregnant in their second trimester when they got the Spanish flu. And it wasn't like all their babies had schizophrenia. It wasn't like that, but they had a higher than normal chance of having schizophrenia 20 years later. That's usually when it appears in people who are at risk.
Do you know if schizophrenia also has an olfactory dysfunction element to it?
It does. I think it's an olfactory deficit. There are some, like seasonal affective disorders. Sometimes people have hyperosmia.
Yeah.
Now here I'm talking a little bit outside my expertise, so I'm just trying to remember the literature. But I believe,
Hyperosmia is when you have heightened sense of smell, right?
right. And some people with seasonal affective disorder have a heightened sense of smell, and some have decreased sense of smell. In schizophrenia, I believe it's a deficit in smell, because the studies that have studied this, because people with schizophrenia feel some relief from nicotine, they smoke a lot, and so they had to control for the amount of smoking that people did when they tested them on smell, if I'm remembering correctly.
It would make sense.
Yeah.
Okay, then we'll move on to some of your research that you've done. So, yeah, you want to share some of the research that you have done, maybe your favorite or what
Yeah.
you're most excited to talk about?
Oh, I love all my children the same. Um, so in regards to humans, it's relatively new for me, although the work I've done for the past 30 years really supports understanding the human system. And we can talk about that more later. But it really all came to a head during COVID. And I don't know if you were included in the Slack group that started like in February or March of 2020. It was about 600 olfactory neuroscientists across the world ended up joining this group.
Wow.
Because we were all starting to hear, about smell deficits with COVID. And and so colleagues were sharing what they were hearing from their colleagues in Italy, and because that was really where most of the first information on smell loss, hit the news. And there was kind of a collective holy crap, because, for those of us who work on central olfaction, which means olfaction in the brain, we knew this story right, about the possibility of an olfactory insult being a trigger for neurodegeneration ending in various diseases. And it really was scary. And we didn't know at first whether the olfactory receptor neurons, which, sit in your nose and find odors and get hit by whatever's in your nose, and then their other ends go straight into your brain. If that virus could get into those neurons, it would be like a superhighway into your cerebral cortex, which is really bad. Turns out those cells don't have the right receptor to do that, which is really good. But, it still nagged on me. And I spent a lot of time sitting on Zoom meetings with the autopsy team here at the University of Chicago, asking questions. And, we really didn't have any data. And so I just kept worrying, which is, when you can't leave your house, you sit in your kitchen, you work for all this time. And I just kept thinking about, well, is it possible that there's virus getting in the brain? And so in 2022, there was finally enough research out that I could put it together. And it looks like it's possible, either, virus having infiltrated or other kinds of inflammation getting in the brain. And then a study came out from the UK Biobank where they had people who were scanned. It's this long longitudinal public health study where they're taking all kinds of measures, and they have about 2,500 or so people who are doing MRI scans every few years. So they had a group of people that had been scanned before the pandemic. They came back for their next scans, and about a few hundred of them had had COVID. And they were able to see that there was, small changes, but changes consistent with neurodegeneration in areas connected to the olfactory system. So this said, okay, it's time for me to put my money where my mouth is. I've been working on rats all these years. I've been telling people it's the same system. Let's just work on humans. And so, I wrote that paper, and since then I'm collaborating with several people on human projects. One, Mark Albers, and a group at Mass General, and with Jay Pinto here at the University of Chicago, where they have a smell test that can track cognitive decline. They're called Aroma, AROMHA is the company. And the first paper has come out from them, and it looks like it does a pretty good job of indicating cognitive decline in people. And it can be done remotely, like you don't have to go into a clinic to do it.
And is that directly related to COVID or just in general?
No, I think their first goal is to test for Alzheimer's disease, but the goal is to be able to distinguish among different diseases, right? Because they all have slightly different olfactory deficits. And then age, of course. We all, smell declines with age, so it gets everybody very scared. But that's a normal aging thing, and it doesn't mean that your brain is dissolving.
Do you know if that's the same with someone who trains their nose all the time?
That's a good question. Michael Leon did a study, it was a small study. I think it started out being a bigger study, and then COVID hit, so a lot of people dropped out. But using an odor diffuser at night, and just sleeping with it on, and they got some, it was a small study. They got some promising results. I think that, as more and more people start studying this, it might help, but we also know that smell training only helps about 25% of people who do it. Now, people who can smell and just smell stuff all the time as part of their normal life pattern, like those of us who have on my shelves back here a bunch of odor vials, maybe that helps the brain, but we don't know. We just don't know. I mean, there are a lot of studies. They're all, on the smaller side. It's hard to get people to stick with the training for months and months, which is what you want to do. So I don't know, maybe look at perfumers and see if they have decreased chance of having, neurodegenerative disease.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you also look at perception and the sense of smell, right?
Right. Right.
What have you done with that topic?
Yeah, so we're doing one study that is looking at the influence between memory and perception, like when you smell mixtures, looking at the role of our memory processes that might affect how much we can smell in a mixture. This idea
Oh,
that you can only smell 3 or 4 odors in a mixture. Lots and
that's
lots
a
of
thing? That's something that
yeah,
they say?
yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
I
There
didn't
are a
know that.
lot of studies showing that. And it's a thing, right? But that's also the same number of things you can remember for a short amount of time. And smelling is an extended enough process that it might be subject to memory. So we're testing people now. I don't know the results yet. It's a long time to get data because people have to come in 5 days in a row to get tested. But
So perception in regards to like you're given a composition, a scent composition, and then you identify four of the
or
things you
you as
smell,
many as you can, right?
as many as you can.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Well, you have to learn to first we have to train them to identify the odors. Then they have to identify
That's
the
the hard part.
odors. Yeah, that's the hard part. And I am terrible at it. I am terrible at it. But I have this great student who is a perfumer and he's working on this project. So go Eli.
And and so is it that perception also includes memory as in like memories, or is it more the way of remembering the actual scent?
Yeah, yeah. It's the
Okay.
memory capacity, I think,
Memory
is a
capacity.
part of our ability to tell what's in a mixture. Now, aside from that, like decades of studies in rats looking at how they smell odors and how they change the way their brains work depending on what they need to do, right? So if you ask them, is this odor the same as that one? I can ask them in a way that they can tell me that pretty easily. I can say, is this odor different from that one? That's a different question. And their
Mm.
brains, in fact, behave differently when they tell a difference than when they tell a similarity. Their behavior is different, and their brains give us different answers about how olfaction works. And it looks like humans do this as well. Uh, they
Oh.
show similar responses.
Like different things light up in the brain, different aspects of your brain light up, whether you're
Mm.
telling a difference or similarity in a scent.
Yeah, not so much light up because brains, they're not modular. Basically, billions of neurons all connected to each other. There are certain areas that we know we need in order to smell. If you don't have an olfactory bulb, it's hard to smell. Although there's a caveat to that. If if you damage your visual cortex, you have trouble seeing. It doesn't mean that vision lives there. Vision, our psychological experience of vision lives everywhere. Our psychological experience of smell engages really our whole brain. But if we look at how the neurons in, say, the olfactory bulb coordinate when a rat is answering one question versus another, they make a different pattern of activity. So if you looked at like a human brain scan where you can say, oh, this place lights up more, it just means it's more active,
Yeah.
you would see it light up the same. But it's within that lighting up, the neurons are responding differently because they're doing a different job. Yeah. Yeah.
So you talked about the COVID pandemic and how that
Mhm.
affected your research. So
Right.
do you work a lot or work with anosmia groups with that area of research as well?
Not so much, although I am thinking about it just because I think it's an important question. I've been talking to Katie Boateng
Hmm.
to think about some projects that we could collaborate on and involving smell and memory basically. When you get to be at a certain stage in your career, you have tenure. I've published stuff I want to publish, I enjoy my work, but what's the new question I can ask? I always want to ask a new question. And so yes, I'm thinking about expanding into that. And this work I'm doing with Christina Zolano, I think is really fascinating. I mean, being able to see how the human olfactory bulb responds at a similar kind of resolution as we can see in our recordings in rats is really kind of astounding. And this is, non-invasive, but we get, really beautiful recordings. Or I should say her lab gets, and I hang around and give advice. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to explore in this topic, and I also
Yeah.
think that the knowledge that you have complements that. And I mean, you already know about olfactory dysfunction,
Right.
so it would work, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And, there's this cool thing that sort of got me started thinking about dysfunction, which how it not being just like you remove a module so you can't smell, right? But more that you change the way the system works. And this, Walter Freeman exposed me to this work when I was a graduate student. One of the best models for studying depression is to take out an animal's olfactory bulbs. And we don't know if they get sad, right? We just know that they exhibit these behavioral responses that mimic what's called depression-linked anxiety. So they get more anxious in a brightly lit area. They have anhedonia. They don't drink sucrose as much, a couple of things like that. If you treat them with antidepressants, they get better. I mean, they act normal, right? And it's the only animal model that tells you how long an antidepressant is going to take to work in humans. Like some of them take weeks, right? And most of the animal models just it's what's called acute. The relief happens immediately. So they can't tell how it's going to work in humans. But for this one, it takes about a similar time course as it takes in humans. And also the animals don't show this kind of behavior if you just cut the olfactory nerve. So you make them anosmic, but leave the olfactory bulbs intact. They can't smell in both cases, but if the olfactory bulbs are there, they don't show all these weird behavioral effects. And so goes back to the olfactory bulb being part of the limbic system. It's part of the system that regulates emotional tone and regulates emotional response. The neurons in the olfactory bulb are about 10 times more active than other neurons in cortex. So they're firing away all the time. Every time you inhale through your nose, there's this barrage of activity that goes everywhere in your limbic system. And so if you take that away, the other parts of the brain, they're used to getting all of this drive, all this excitatory drive just in the background. It's gone. So then they don't work right. Right. Now, why this makes animals depressed rather than happy, I don't know, but that's what it does. And so guy who used to be in Yuri Bujaki's lab after, I talked with Yuri about this idea a number of years back, and they did this great experiment where they shut down really the way that the olfactory bulb drives olfactory cortex for a long time, for many days. And they showed the same effect. So they didn't have to take the olfactory bulbs out. They just shut it down. And they got a similar effect. And if they replaced missing activity with artificial activity, they rescued the deficit in the animals. And so, it's really, olfaction really is a part of keeping our brains kind of motoring in the right place. I like to call it the baseline. It's just your baseline, like in a club. It's the beat. And if you don't have it, other stuff doesn't work right. It's really hard to dance in a club if they turn off the music, right? Or the clubs where people just have their own music. It's like,
Silent disco.
how does that work?
So, because you said there were the two different ways with the mice that they were testing depression. One
Mhm.
was they took away their sense of smell, and one is they actually removed their olfactory bulb. Do
Right.
you know what happens when you have anosmia?
Mostly anosmia is just in the nose, right? It affects the receptor sheet, so kills neurons. Now, a lot of people lose their sense of smell, get depressed, but it's hard to know if that's, because of maybe some change in the way the internal system is working, or because it really sucks to lose your sense of smell.
Yes.
It really takes, a lot of enjoyment out of life, and sort of makes you separate, a little separate from
Mhm.
the world, right?
Yeah, it's a
So,
bit
so,
isolating.
so it's hard, we can't do the experiments in humans that we can do in rats and mice, right? And we wouldn't want to.
But
But
does
yeah, I'm sorry, go
but
ahead.
does that sorry, my brain is just exploding right now. So does that mean that when you have anosmia, your brain is still sort of processing smells, but it's just not reading the smell in a way? So like you can't smell that's lemon, but your brain still
Yeah.
is having activity because you're
Yeah, yeah, it still does. I mean, like your olfactory cortex, your piriform cortex, it's called olfactory cortex. It's really not. There's a little part of it very close to the olfactory bulb that is called the anterior olfactory nucleus. And that is primary olfactory cortex, I think. And that this thing, piriform cortex, which is really big, gets input and sends output to. It depends on the species because we don't have all the data in all the species, but it looks like to every sensory system. So it's really, although it gets, most input from olfaction, and it acts, as a primary olfactory area, it's connected with all your other senses as well, and with other parts of the limbic system and neuromodulators and all kinds of stuff going on there. And so even if you can't smell, that cortex is still active. It's still getting lots of input. And the olfactory bulb is still intact. So there's more input to the olfactory bulb from the brain than there is from the nose. So the neurons in the olfactory bulb are still getting input, and different neurons then get the sensory input, and it's still getting input from all of the systems that are called neuromodulator systems. So like serotonin and norepinephrine, like norepinephrine is like adrenaline sort of, dopamine, histamine, oxytocin, everything is like dumping into the olfactory bulb the same way it does into the thalamus. And and so those neurons are sort of still getting input. Now, people who are anosmic, in general, their olfactory bulbs tend to get smaller. And in rats, their olfactory bulbs do get smaller, but they don't disappear. So it's still keeping sort of the tone of the system going. And I think, and this, I'm just speculating, I think what happens is that because the olfactory bulb is still there and connected, that the system sort of adjusts to work differently rather than just, it's just gone, right? I mean, all of a sudden. That's my intuition, but I don't have any data about that.
Well, that happens with our eyes too, right? They
Yeah,
adjust depending on
right,
how they're functioning.
right.
So
Yeah,
that would make sense. But I just have never thought about like I just thought, oh, anosmia, sense of smell is gone, but I never thought about what happens after it actually
yeah,
goes through your nose. So it's a great thing to learn. I'm very
yeah.
excited. Okay, so we're actually going through our time very fast because
Okay.
we're having a lot of fun here. So, just before we run out of time, I wanted to ask you our last questions here, which is what do you wish everyone understood or knew about our brains and olfactory perception?
Oh, I wish they knew how important smell is to really who we are. Even if we don't pay attention to smell, if it's gone, it disconnects us from some really important sort of connections between our thinking and our body, right? It's really involved in this visceral response. And I just wish people, knew it was important. And I wish more people enjoyed just smelling stuff, because they look at me like I'm a weirdo when when I say smell this, it's terrible. And no, so I wish they really could celebrate and enjoy this sense that really I think is a part of what makes us human, even though we don't think it is. Yeah.
And have you taken some time to look into like how smell affects culture and identity? Is that also something that you're interested in? I would think so by
Yeah, I mean, clearly I'm interested in it. And it's something I've learned a lot about. Recently, I'm working on a book that hopefully will be out early 2028. No title yet with basic books, but it's really about sort of smell's role in kind of who we are internally and who we are as social beings. And I mean, what I hope is that people can appreciate smell a little more in their lives. I mean, they don't need to understand how an olfactory bulb works. They can leave that to their science friends unless they want to, which I would tell them about for hours if they'll listen. But I want people to appreciate how important this sense is and how important it is also for brain health. So,
yeah. It's still unbelievable to me how often I walk into a room and I give some sort of short talk or demonstration
mhm.
in my work, and people are just blown away because they've never experienced something like that. And it's it's so strange to me because it's not like I think I did anything that amazing
Right.
or phenomenal, but it's because the sense of smell is so underestimated, so underappreciated. And
Yeah.
it's so sad that that's the case, but I hope that people like us, the others that I interview and beyond, bring that forward a little bit more. And I think it's happening. I think it's blowing up more and more and more. Although I've been told I'm in like some sort of social media bubble that
Yeah. Well, I think, I studied this for, almost 30 years. Nobody cared. They would in fact ask me, why would you study that as a neuroscientist? And I would try to explain how important it is. And then COVID hit and I was like, oh, I get it now. And then, people call
yeah.
me and they want interviews and, it's interesting. So I think when people lose it, they realize how important it is.
Mm-hmm.
And, maybe we can make it so they don't have to lose it to find out how important it is. That'd be
Yeah.
nice. Yeah.
Yeah. That was the same thing with Odoropa. Even though
Yeah.
the proposal was written before COVID, it came out right
Oh,
at
wow.
COVID time, like, no, like in the November after, but still it was the time around COVID.
Yeah.
And so that was a time when everyone was kind of appreciating the sense
Yeah.
of smell. So it was a good time for a project like that to come out. The last question, please share, what are you up to now? You mentioned your book, but is there
Yeah.
anything else that you want to share about what you're up to now?
Yeah. So I'm involved in, a few projects doing some human work, and we're following up another project in rats that just kind of hit me over the head a few years ago. I've been working on rats for all these years, and the NIH, however long ago it was, said we should test male and female subjects. And I always used males because they're bigger and they can carry more hardware on their head, right? So and we started including females, but then we really did the experiment to like balance everything and test them in the right order and, control for lots of things and track estrus in the females. Massive, massive sex differences in how long they sniff an odor. Just like 40% longer in females when they're discriminating odors. And, I've never seen anything that big. It's like I've been studying these tiny, my friend who's a birder says, people are always excited when they're not birders to see the big red bird on the fence, but the really interesting one are these tiny little things that look like brown sparrows, but they're not. So I've been studying those tiny little brown sparrows for my whole career. And then this big red bird lands on the fence and says, hello, I've been here all along. And it's such a big difference. And it doesn't track with estrus. There's no effect of, intact hormones. So we're doing that study. We're doing a bigger study on behavior, and we're manipulating the hormonal status of the animals to see if it, is, we think it's the males are sampling shorter because of testosterone.
I've
Yeah,
heard this somewhere though that females have a better sense of smell than males.
human females do have a better sense of smell than males, but males can, if they just get training, they can do just as well.
Okay.
It looks like female rats have a stronger input to the olfactory bulb. So I don't know if the receptors are more sensitive or if they just have more of them, or, we don't really know, but it's a stronger input signal to the bulb. But, that sex difference flips if we just give them an odor and let them smell it as long as they want. The females will smell it shorter.
Oh, interesting.
And don't ask them to do anything with it. Yeah. Anyway, so we're, following this up, and I have a great graduate student who's working on this project, and that's a lot of fun. Yeah, so that's mainly what I'm working on. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, well, we can wrap up. I think one day we need to do another interview because this was too short. It was so fun and too short.
Yeah, let's do another one after my book comes out.
Yes, because
Yeah.
I really enjoy the topic. For me, it's so interesting. And always when I talk to neuroscientists, it's always so interesting to hear what they have to say about smell in the brain
Yeah.
or brains, smell and brains.
Yeah. So Ted Bullock was like an evolutionary neuroscientist, right? And he was this old guy at UC San Diego, and I think he was at UC San Diego, but he would always say, there is no the brain. They're all different, especially different animals. And so I always,
Yeah, it's true.
but it's easy to say the brain because that's what I studied, the
Yeah.
brain. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on our podcast.
Yeah.
And I think we'll have you back.
Okay, great. That'll be fun. Thanks.